All right, so good afternoon and welcome to the IBC Toronto's Changing Media Landscape Key Trends and Opportunities in 2022 professional development event. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mandy Gibson. I identify with the pronouns she, her, and I have the pleasure of serving as president of IBC Toronto. IBC Toronto acknowledges the land we are hosting this virtual event from is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Please note that today's session is being recorded. To ensure an inclusive experience for all attendees, closed captioning is available by clicking the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. So while we just wait for those numbers to add up here for attendees, I want to note that IBC Toronto is proud to be the largest chapter of the International Association of Business Communicators worldwide. The chapter supports its community of business communication professionals with innovative thinking, shared best practices, in-depth learning, and career guidance. And I also want to mention that it is currently membership month, and until November 12th, we're offering 20% off professional membership fees and 25% off group memberships. So please take advantage of this limited time offer. So just checking that we are recording. And we are in for a great webinar this afternoon. We'll be hearing from 5 expert communicators from a variety of backgrounds. Feel free to live tweet about this session and tag IBC Toronto at IBC Toronto. We'll add this to the chat to help you reference it throughout the session. And we're running today's session as a Zoom webinar, so you'll only hear and see our panelists, the moderator, and myself. I encourage you to please let us know if you have any questions by entering them into the chat function on Zoom. Please remember to share them with all attendees, and we'll do our best to address them throughout the session. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Daniel Tisch, President and CEO of Argyle, to kick things off. Daniel is the CEO and owner of one of Canada's largest communication consulting firms, Argyle. He's also an IBC Toronto member, fellow of the Canadian Public Relations Society, and former chair of Global Alliance for Public Relations and Communication Management. So Daniel, over to you, and thank you for moderating our panel today.
Hey, great. Well, thank you, Mandy, for your volunteer leadership of IBC Toronto. I've been an IBC member for about 25 years now, and amazing to see the continued services and so much of it provided by volunteers. So thank you to you, everyone who gives of their time to make communicators more successful and more professional. It's a great topic we have today. We're talking about how the media landscape has changed, but more important, how it's changed us, how it's changed our role, how it's changed our opportunity, how the opportunity to do better, play at a higher, to be in your organizations, whether you're a consultant aspiring to advise the C-suite, or you're inside a great organization aspiring to do the same. We hope today's session will be really helpful. And the starting point really, I guess, is what's that landscape and how are some great communicators and their organizations adapting? And so we've got an incredible panel here to talk about that. In no particular order, I'm just going to actually go with whoever I see first here. I'll start with Sophie Nadeau, who's VP Reputation, Executive Training, and National Media Lead at Edelman. Sophie has an incredibly diverse career. She's a former department at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa in the pre-Trump phase. So, she doesn't have as interesting stories as she might if she'd worked during the Trump phase, but I'm sure she's got some amazing ones. But more importantly, these days, she's advised more than 100 companies and organizations in every imaginable sector. So welcome, Sophie. Delighted also to have here with us today Wojtek Dabrowski, who is the managing partner at Provident Communications. Also brings a former journalist's keen perspective to our discussions today. 10 years as a business journalist for Thomson Reuters, Financial Post for CP. Had senior leadership positions at major financial institutions, RBC, TD Bank, Manulife, and is now, providing advice as a consultant to leading global brands. So welcome, Wojtek. We're joined here by an organization that everybody knows because we all use it, and that is the Toronto Transit Commission. And Shabnam Durrani is the head of corporate communications at the TTC, and she joined the TTC after long service in the healthcare sector. She began her career as a lawyer. She worked in healthcare for many years. She's also worked at Queen's Park in political roles. So many diverse experiences that we have today. And then finally, we have Sean Pasternak here. And Sean, I've been following Sean's work for many, many years. He had a 14-year career at Bloomberg News, where he had the chance to interview some of the top CEOs and executives and policymakers in Canada. And he currently leads Manulife's global external communications team. So that's media relations, social media, recognition management. So incredible panel. And I'll add to that my own experience, close to a decade working in government and in the last 20 years. So looking forward to the conversation. So let's start by talking about the landscape. And I know we're getting a little bit of noise from feedback. And so I'll ask the panelists just to maybe just mute themselves if they're not speaking. So let's start off by talking about the impact of the pandemic on the media landscape, and what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're feeling, maybe where are we going to start here? I'll start with Wojtek today. I mean, you're a former journalist. You keep close tabs on what's happening in the newsrooms. And I know that news media resources these days are at record lows, even while consumption seems to be at record highs. And so in this really competitive environment, how do you see them changing the way they prioritize their coverage and their stories?
That's a great first question, Dan. Thanks a lot. And thanks for having me join you guys. I think it's a great discussion to have and a good jumping off point, because obviously the last 18 months have been a tremendous period of transition. Just a couple of sort of mega trends to point to, the pandemic being the blindingly obvious one, which made every journalist, in addition to their beat, have to essentially take on a second day job and cover the pandemic from every imaginable aspect. So, the technology reporter at the Globe and Mail became the technology and pandemic reporter. The economics reporter at the Star became the economics and pandemic reporter. And all of a sudden, their attention is even more fractured than before, which as a result raises the bar for all of us in communications in terms of our ability to tell our stories. The other mega trend that's continued unabated, and in fact, I suggest to you has been accelerated by the pandemic, is obviously the financial and economic pressures on every newsroom. So we've seen layoffs virtually across the board. The United States is no different than Canada in this regard. While there is hiring in certain niches and verticals of the news business, it remains, I would say, fairly distressed in terms of financial resources. So precisely at a time where the most is needed, the least is available, and that makes for quite a difficult environment. And against that backdrop, in terms of how that's prompted adaptation from folks like us, I'd say from our perspective, it's never been more important to obviously spend a lot of time with the journalists who are in your network and with whom you have relationships. Those things are just gaining prominence, because in order for you to be able, as a communicator or a PR consultant, to cut through the noise, you need to be able to reach them on their own terms and understand not just the reporter, but also their end reader. So we're spending a lot more time on coffees, hanging out, in calls like this one, catching up, talking about home life, what it's like. And then through that, talking about obviously the stories that we want to tell for our clients, and also figuring out what journalists are interested in. One of the things we pride ourselves on the most is kind of thinking like a journalist. Our head of earned media, obviously, is a former assignment editor at Global News, and she comes to every story with that lens still. And I think that makes a massive difference in an environment like this one, where the approach of, I have an announcement to ram down your throat, it's just simply ineffectual now, and I would argue never was to begin with. So really need to think globally and through the lens of the journalist a lot more. And if you're uncomfortable with that as a concept, I'd suggest to you it's really time to sort of sharpen up around that. build those relationships and really make the most of what is very much a period of transition.
Really interesting. Thank you. So building on that, I'm going to go to Sophie here as another former journalist here, and Wojtek focused a lot on kind of the economic change, and I know one thing that from our past conversations that you follow a lot is kind of the social change in the newsrooms, right? So how the content of the coverage has changed, and even how they're responding to the racial justice movement, and the demands for the internal and external demands for change. How's that shaping coverage and changing the game for journalists and for us?
There are a couple of really interesting forces to pay attention to here that are shifting story choice in newsrooms. One is a correction that should have happened a long time ago, which is newsrooms have finally come to terms with the fact that they're largely white and male. And so, if you're a guy in a suit, not a great time to try and get attention, and rightfully so. A correction has been happening in newsrooms where, you can easily see, especially on the opinion pages, is a desire to feature new voices and interesting voices, diverse voices. It's certainly time for that. And at the same time, too, newsrooms are using a ton of data to drive their editorial choices, because those business pressures that you just heard about, they have to figure out a way to make money, and the data is helping them inform their decisions. So we have this correction happening on diversity and inclusion. We have this data that's driving story choice, which is, by the way, I think changing the way newsrooms look at what works and what doesn't. So a desire to have more personalized stories that the audience can connect to, which, by the way, then by extension deprioritizes traditional corporate institutional news. Right. And rightfully so, again, right? Like, if you want people to buy and read the news, then you want to make it relevant for them. So those two forces are really, really interesting. And what we're seeing is, in many cases, those stories that you could pitch pre-COVID are literally going nowhere, in this environment. And there's one last thing that I find fascinating. Newsrooms, to their credit, are pushing corporate folks to the paid side of their business. So, for instance, the Globe and Mail is looking at events, ways to monetize, and good for them, right? Fantastic. They understand our clients have money and are paying in advertising and paid and all that. So, but it's also changing what the newsrooms are willing to entertain, right? So oftentimes our folks will pitch and they'll be like, you know what, that's a paid placement. Go and do sponsored content. And that's super interesting to watch as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, it's interesting seeing too with social media just how most of us already know, pick up news, right? What's happening, we learn from social media, right? And so a senior business journalist was telling me last year that, everything that they're focused on and all the incentives in the newsroom for business journalists are around not company news, but it's either, insight on the news, right, which provides a deeper opportunity for clients, or stories of conflict and personality. What are we seeing?
Story, yeah, exactly.
Stories of conflict and personality, right? So it's interesting to see that. Let's bring in Shabnam here. And Shabnam, I'm obviously, your organization makes the news every single day, but I'm curious about kind of the pulse of what you're picking up, and the sorts of stories that they're interested in now, and how that's shaping the way you communicate at the TTC. And I know that you've got some really interesting perspectives on this. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so I think the one thing that's different for the TTC than probably a lot of your clients, Sophie and Wojtek, is that we literally make the news for everything. Even things we don't want to make the news for, we're in the news for. So what we have found is that the pandemic has brought a lot of heightened scrutiny. Everyone weighs in, even people who have never taken the TTC in their lives are weighing in on how we do things. And the other thing that we've also sort of found is that, everyone's a newsmaker, right? Anyone with a cell phone, anyone who can make a video, they're out there, they're doing it. And so for us, responding to a lot of things on social media has become a big part of what we do. So what we've actually really tried to do is, put more markers out there on how we want to sort of communicate and what we want to lead with, right? And I think a lot of organizations have done this. The pandemic has been a time to really show your values, right? So we've doubled down on things like safety and transparency, and have really, spent a lot of time crafting the message. We use news releases a lot. I know there's a big debate on it in the industries if press releases are dead or not. We've kind of come back to using them a lot to kind of put our message out there and really sort of, bring life to the spokespeople we use, right? We've really worked hard on making our CEO a pretty dynamic spokesperson throughout, this entire pandemic, though being, a middle-aged white man. We've done a lot of work to kind of, make him someone people follow and put trust in. So a bit of a different experience than a lot of people, but, a lot of great insight. It's true. Everyone's become a bit of a COVID reporter along with whatever they do.
Yeah, exactly. When resources are stretched in the newsroom, everyone ends up on the COVID beat, don't they? Right. Okay, so we're going to go around the horn, once, and we're going to make it a little bit more freewheeling in a little bit. But let's bring Sean into the conversation for initial perspective. Sean's in a unique position, perhaps, in that obviously representing a really big, high-profile brand that's often finds itself pulled into stories. Sometimes maybe against your will, Sean. So I'd love a little storytelling from you on that. What stories do you welcome? What stories do you worry about? How is the type of stories that you're in your world and in your company's world changing?
Yeah, no, thank you, Daniel. I mean, I think, just to jump on, what some of the other panelists have been saying. I mean, you have to think through a pandemic lens, no matter what the subject matter is or the nature of the query is. And as a former journalist, like many of the panelists here, I do understand, look, the media has a job to do. It may not always align with what we're trying to say, but they're doing what they need to get done. So, it's forced us to make some very tough decisions when it comes to some of the queries coming in. And that was almost, day one of the pandemic. Inherently, you want to respond to every question coming your way, but you learn really quickly that many of these end up being fishing expeditions. And, this is where, as a blue chip global company, you're going to get asked a little bit of everything. And sometimes it's not in your best interest to always participate. So sometimes, and I'm sure many of us have heard this before, it becomes an issue of, well, do you want to be the only company who doesn't comment in this piece? And sometimes that's okay. You have to be okay with that because, we don't have to be in every industry article to be relevant. But on the flip side of that, I think there's been a lot of opportunities that have come a variety of fronts of this. We were one of the first companies openly discussing the mental health impact to people. So I think it's such an important conversation to have. And just like many other opportunities where we've just been able to get out in front of it and sort of embrace the conflict a little bit and tell some positive stories there too.
Love that. That's a great example. So on mental health, and that's a key decision, I think, for so many people who are in our audience today, right? You're communicators, you have to help advise your senior leaders or your clients, where do we want to lead? Where do we want to follow? Where do we want to maybe be silent and let others, go out in front? So Sean used the example of mental health, where they decided strategically they were going to lead. I'd love for others to jump in on this. How do you decide where your organization or your clients are going to take a leadership position? What are the factors that go into that decision? Give us an example.
I can certainly jump in there for sure. Listen, two things. One is it still surprises me the degree to which clients let the news happen to them rather than strategically make the choice of the conversations they want to be a part of and actively contribute to that, right? And the other issue we have is that there are easily double, triple the amount of PR people than there are journalists. Right. So I think the way to attack this is not like see a conversation and say, oh, it's happening, we should be a part of that, but rather have a more meaningful mindset that prioritizes curiosity and objectivity, i.e. like your company is legitimately involved in 2 or 3 big key issues. Maybe it is mental health. And if it is, fantastic, because it's so critically important. But make those decisions prior to the news cycle all of a sudden being interested in it, and then do meaningful things, actionable things in those categories. And I would even submit for most of the people on this call who aren't the TTC, you're going to have 10 great stories that your company is legitimately in. one of those stories belongs in the news cycle. The other 9, you can tell to your employees, you can put on your website, you can talk to social, you can actually even just manage your own expectations around what's possible and then figure out a way forward from there. But it honestly, like clients who wake up and they go, oh my God, mental health, everybody's talking about it. We need to be in this now. That to me is just, you're starting from the completely wrong perspective.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And you can look, ideally you're looking for a little white space too, where is there a leadership opportunity that others are not seizing, but that, we have both, passion and credibility in terms of what we've done, not just what we said, right? Who else has an example or a thought? I'd love to hear from others on this question of how you decide where to lead,
So it's Jemnim. I'm happy to jump in. Oh, sorry. Can you guys hear me? I never know. I'm on my husband's setup right now.
Your video's cutting out a bit, but we can hear you fine.
Okay. So I think I mentioned it before, but for us, it was really focusing on our values, right? For us, it was safety, and that became kind of a real natural focal point for us. And pretty much every communication we have put out in the past year and a half has talked about safety, and this is a paramount and a key value for us. The other thing that really helped us figure out, I guess, how to lead was that we experienced the pandemic at the TTC, I think, a bit differently than most people, right? The bulk of our workforce was frontline and had to go into work, outside the house every single day since the start, right?
Yeah.
So I think that also allowed us to lead because we experienced it like very differently. There was a time sort of in the height of the lockdown, it was basically just like PTC workers, grocery workers, and healthcare workers, it seemed like, were the only people going out there. You couldn't even get a doctor's appointment, right? You had to do it all online. And so we really kind of took that experience and built on it. And we really chose in our actions to lead, and then in our communications to lead on that as well, right? We were one of the first organizations that started posting around our COVID cases. So we have a webpage that posts every single sort of COVID case we've had. And those are all ways we chose to lead because we saw how the pandemic fit with our workforce, fit with our values, and that's what we kind of went forward with. But to Sophie's point, there's a lot of other things we could kind of poke our noses into, and we've really kind of chosen not to, right? We've really kind of focused on what works for us, what makes sense for our brand. And there are sometimes we wade into other things, but we've really focused. And I think that's important for everybody to think about, right? So that's kind of the TTC experience.
Interesting. Wojtek, I know on this topic, I know when we were talking before, you were talking about, part of leading too is in media relations is not targeting 20 journalists, it's choosing 3, right? And going deep. Talk to us a little, and maybe just for everyone's benefit, if without necessarily naming client names, can you give an example of, an approach you've tried that's really helped one of your clients lead in this in this way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, at a high level, I'd answer your question with your organization should lead where it's the most credible, and it's where it's the most authentic. And as someone else just articulated, I think often that aligns with where your values lie. Now, all of that is good within the walls of your organization. The moment you open the door and try to talk to anybody on the street about those values or about your leadership in any particular area, the conversation gets a lot more difficult. The reporter that you might be engaging might have absolutely no interest in talking about the values of your organization. They might be very narrowly focused on your earnings performance or some vertical inside your business. So I think, to your comment about praying and spraying, and this goes for any approach, including kind of values-driven media coverage that you're hoping to secure, you have to know these reporters like the back of your hand if you're going to be effective with telling stories that they want to hear and that their readers want to hear about. So, for example, we had a client where we were given an announcement to go and target the media with. The announcement has relevance, has legitimate news value to about 3 or 4 different journalists who covered that particular industry. It's absolutely of no value to anyone else. It's niche-y, it's not a sexy industry. And in the abundance of news that's available any given day, it's really difficult to divert attention onto something like that. So we essentially told the client that. The client refused to believe it. So we said, okay, we'll try it your way. We tried it their way. It did not work whatsoever. And then we said, given that a shot, why don't we retool this pitch, focus it for these 3 journalists specifically, because we know for a fact that they are interested in this. They tell us so, and so on. And it was awesome. The difference was night and day, and the client got exactly what they wanted. But what they got the most in terms of cherished outcomes of any good PR is, as soon as we landed some of that really customized pitching and it turned into coverage, the executive leading the business started to get business inquiries based off that. We saw your name in the story. This is great. We're excited that you're entering this new market. We'd love to discuss. And then all of a sudden, the conversation turns from my opinion versus your opinion to your opinion versus my data point, right? Yeah. And all of a sudden, it becomes a lot easier to have that chat. So it's just it's a matter of doing a little bit of wrestling with your client as well.
Well, I think that's such a good point. And whether you're inside an organization or you know, like you and me and Sophie, you're a consultant providing advice. A consistent theme I'm seeing here is just candor, honesty, and even bravery. You know, having the courage to tell your client, look, in your interest, I love some of the rules of thumb we're hearing about here. Sophie's saying there, probably only 1 in 10 stories. Yeah.
It's really hard to tell people, though, Dan, you're not as interesting as you think you are, right? So that's never an easy conversation.
Except to me, I'm super interested in you, but the media aren't. So I love it. Okay, so let's pivot to kind of the world you're preparing for, and I think that's maybe the most interesting topic of all today, right? And I know that, look, I mean, I think from an employer standpoint, it's pretty hard to predict more than 6 months out of the time if you're even able to do that, right? And so even around return to work, we've said to our team, hey, here's your policy for the next 6 months, but we're going to test and learn. So a lot of the only constant probably is continuous change and acquiring more change management specialties within our profession. But having said that, what are you preparing for? What are you expecting? What are you doing now to get ready for 2022 that might be interesting for our audience today? Sean, I'll start with you.
Sure, and maybe I'll preface it with, I think there's this misconception, certainly among different leaders, that when we get back to some semblance of normalcy, and we certainly are, that everything will be sunshine and roses, in terms of the way that we communicate this to the press. And look, there will be those feelings of optimism and joy, and that's amazing. But I think what the boardrooms need to understand is that the media won't thrive on that. And if you look at any news outlet of choice, you will see the articles that get the most clicks or the videos that get the most views are always going to thrive on conflict. So you have to have that lens, I think, when you're starting to craft what that narrative is. And certainly as we're starting to look in the year ahead, there are ways to embrace that conflict and tell that story with being realistic and understanding this is the new reality. But we also understand, from a media lens, you have certain things you have to convey. So the most positive outcomes is not necessarily going to be what you write on. So we own this. We acknowledge that there is this conflict, and how do companies get ready for for that new normal? And I think, just as an example of that, if you look in the retail space, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a shopping mall recently and this is not an original thought, but you're thinking, this model has to change. This is not sustainable. So if you're in the retail industry, as an example, what are you saying to get out in front of that? You acknowledge that this is a changed environment. How is your business ready to accept that? I think that's what we all need to be thinking about as communicators, how to put that lens on things.
Yeah, no, that's so smart. And I got to say, I don't know if anyone else is with me, but can we all be, sign up for the campaign to ban the words new normal? I want to ban it. So tell me if you're with me here, folks. I find, sitting around waiting for the new normal to be such a perverse idea that just is creating inertia in boardrooms, right? So, there's no new normal. There's just a rolling reality of continuous change that we have to be ready for. So, sorry, there's my little commercial here. I'm picking up on Sean's very good point. Other strategies we're seeing to prepare for 2022. Sophie.
A couple of things I'm really excited about. So one is, if you accept that newsrooms will integrate data into editorial choices, media relations people absolutely need to have a clear picture of how their stories and activities and decisions play in market. So if you don't have a really great data and insights program around your comms, you're flying blind. And it's really interesting. So we've used data at Edelman to, for instance, like some of my clients have been subject to investigations. You know, your clients will get all worked up about it. Everybody's stressed, and then literally nobody reads it. Like, context is everything. Or more importantly, like, you can watch the newsrooms and the stories they return to, and then be able to predictively think, oh, that's going to happen 10 minutes from now, right? So data, totally important. Consolidation in the media environment, also important, right? We're noticing that most of the engagement in market right now is leaning towards national prominent titles with existing, visibility. So your Globe and Mails, your CBCs, they just keep getting bigger and bigger. New York Times, bigger and bigger. Good and bad, right? Bad means, like, if you've got a story that doesn't sing in that space, you're going nowhere. If you have a really great story that sings, you can make one phone call and make it go everywhere. So that's really interesting. And then the last thing that I'm watching for is, I've trained every C-suite executive and CEO on our client list. And I'm more and more encouraged that leadership in business understands that this expertise, that communications is critically important to business operations. To that earlier point about, like, place a story, earn a client, earn a customer, like, it's never been more integrated. And, our trust data reconfirms the idea that people will trust media reports and journalists above every other channel. I mean, I won't bring up Facebook and other social media channels, but those of us who work with journalists, this is still a very valuable area of expertise. And I'm really encouraged to see comms people at the leadership table at the companies that we're advising. So that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, no, more critical than ever. I don't know about you, but I want to know the difference between earned, owned, and paid media. And the insight media deliver is so critical, right, to the decisions we make. Even if we don't often know, who's credible and who isn't, or the consumer often doesn't know. And I love your point about data too, right? I mean, like, I think the days of the sage communicator showing up and saying, well, I've listened to your challenge, in the last 5 minutes, and my instinct tells me we got to do this.
Yeah, I don't trust my gut anymore either, right? Like, it's not about gut.
We're not the audience, right? And so I think more and more we need, the smart answer is, I don't know, but I've got an insight. It's either A or B. We're going to test both, and we'll let you know next week which it is, right? I think that's the future. Who else wants to jump in on this? What are you doing to prepare for 2022? Shabnam?
So from the TTC, we're doing a couple things. So one of the things we did in the pandemic that we are definitely going to kind of carry forward with is that we invested heavily in our internal communications and really began to see our employees as brand ambassadors. And so really invested in making sure they had the information around what was going on at the TTC. A big challenge we were running into is that they would often find out from, like, the news or the TV. And so we really bought into the idea that our employees are kind of helping us get what we are doing out there. And that's something we're really going to continue working on. And the other thing for us too is, I think we're kind of getting back a bit to the business of transit. COVID kind of overtook everything, and now we're going to look at, why do people ride the TTC? They ride it to get from point A to point B. So getting them the information they need. We're looking to put people in our transit control. So communications will have a voice at that table and a real line of sight into sort of how our system's running. And we're also looking at making a lot of connections at a community level, and kind of going more into sort of neighborhoods and making sure people sort of know what's going on with their routes, knowing if they're late, looking at ethnic media as well, right? And just sort of making sure that everyone who rides the TTC knows what's going on and making it accessible.
You're going deeper from our last conversation into community niches, aren't you, through media, right? As opposed to just focusing on the big mainstream outlets.
Yeah, and that's what we will still do. We're not abandoning the Globe or the Star or the Sun.
Of course. Yeah.
But we're kind of taking a dual approach here. And I think, we have those big stories that, will certainly probably still dominate the media. but we also just want to make sure our customers know what's going on, right? Really just thinking about who our audience is, right? So
Yeah,
that's what we're getting ready for.
that's
So as you
awesome.
all return to transit, wait for it. So it'll be great.
I'm already taking it.
I love it.
I'm going to put Wojtek on the spot in a moment to tell us what services his clients are most interested in for 2022. Before I do that, though, just a reminder, we want to get the audience into the conversation. Some Q&A is already building. So please start populating that, and we'll come to you guys in a sec. We want to hear your questions or even your insights, since we don't have all the wisdom, among the group of us. So Wojtek, what are clients most interested in buying in terms of services for next year?
Yeah, great question. I think huge degree of awareness probably brought on by the pandemic, Dan, around crisis communication. We're seeing definitely year over year, there was a huge spike from 2019 to 2020, at least within our business, but then also from 2020 to 2021 in the number of CEOs that are coming to us and saying we need overhaul or net new development of our crisis communications plan. We need our spokespeople trained, and we need to practice this work. And I think, that's always great to see. On the cybersecurity side, especially, we're getting a lot more activity this year. I think that's because, virtually it goes without saying, it's a matter of time before you get breached, not a matter of if. So that awareness is always nice to see. We're also partnered up with some real heavyweights on the cybersecurity side of things. So we have a one-stop shop offering for clients between Norton Rose Fulbright providing legal advice, EY providing technology advice, and us obviously helping with the communications in the event of a data breach. So that's actually catching a lot of traction. Beyond that, I would say it's an interesting shift, and I don't know how you guys are seeing it on your end. For us, it's also a lot more. There's some management consulting flavor in here as well. Like we're getting a lot of C-suite leaders approaching us and saying, look, we've got this, it's not a communication, it's a business issue that we have. We're starting to address it, we're starting to tackle it. Come sit down at the table with us and help us think about this. And I think, that's obviously from an intellectually engaging standpoint, it's some of the best work we get to do, along with obviously all the crisis that you see in the newspapers every day. That always keeps the phone buzzing. But that would be the biggest shift. I would say everything else, clients haven't forgotten about doing all of their regular course campaigns throughout the year, all the regular course PR, all those announcements, leadership appointments still require support.
Sure.
So I think that's continuing unabated. But obviously they're also coming around on the idea that, look, let's just not blast this at everyone. Let's actually give this to a few people. Does this need even a press release, or can you pick up the phone and just talk to someone and achieve the same outcome? So there's a lot of that going on as well, but we're pretty excited for 2022.
Yeah, no, great, really, really interesting points. And I've had a thesis for some time that our jobs in the future will be, probably a little bit more like management consultants if we want to command, top salaries and get, access to the higher level functions, supported by robust content marketing engines,
Agreed.
So let's go to some of the questions that are popping up, just to continue the conversation. There are a bunch on data, right? And so I'd love to hear from different voices here actually on this question, because it's so fundamental. How you're using data to sell a story to a journalist, and also how you're using data to share results with your clients or your internal bosses. So Sophie, we'll start with you since you mentioned it, but I'd love everyone to jump in, like just what you're doing in this space, because it's so primary. So
there are a couple of really interesting layers that are happening. I mean, first of all, talk about gaining credibility with the C-suite, right? You need to be able to demonstrate value through your work. And the idea of like MRP and impressions, and those are BS metrics, right? Like we need to be looking at things. I'm sorry, but it's true. I mean, if anybody from MRP is on this call, I'm sorry, but the reality is that we need to think about quality, share of voice, spokesperson pull through, sentiment. So what our DXI team, our insights and analytics team at Edelman has been doing for our clients is they create special reports that, you know, are, well, they're smart and they're thoughtful. They're also rooted in insights and they can be shared up the chain. So all of a sudden, you know, our clients are invited to C-suite conversations because we have data to back up the work that this group does every single day. So that's one way data is working for us. The other thing we're doing is pairing earned media metrics with reputational insights around trust. Of course, Edelman is the house of trust, and we've been researching trust for 21 years. So of course you would not be surprised to hear me connect trust with some of these insights.
Very skillfully and well branded.
Thank you. Hey, I work in PR after all. The other thing I think, which is the most exciting thing for me. So if you accept that newsrooms are super stressed, laying people off and running out of resources, then stands to reason that PR people who do the work, the research work on interesting problems will gain attention. So one of the most successful projects we ran for a client during COVID is we worked with a client to identify the economic impacts of COVID on the tourism sector. And our insights and analytics team went and ran a straight up and down survey. They went and did research. They came up with interesting stats, and then we packaged it as a story. And we were able to place that, and it got like over 2,000 media hits because we just did the work, right? We did the journalism work. And I know there's a lot of, I'd be curious to hear what my former journalist colleagues on this panel feel about this, but there is space for PR people to behave like reporters. And if they do it authentically and objectively, you can generate coverage that way. And we've done that at Edelman a number of times. We're very careful with it. We don't pretend to be journalists, but we absolutely use data to bring reporters to the stories we care about.
Awesome. Let's hear a couple more quickly. We're going to try to keep the answers quick from other, just on this question of how you're using data, whether it's to sell a story or to demonstrate results.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that. And just, you know, similar to Sophie's point, I think it is so important to think like a reporter to the degree you can, and be able to provide them something that is that value add that will help them land that story, make it, you know, that much more impressive to what you're giving. Because I think, you know, so many of us are pushing out, you know, here's the products we're doing, and the first thing, you know, you learn, especially as a business journalist, is that's what companies are expected to do, is to introduce new products. But if you can actually add something, here's how it solves a problem, and here's data to back it up, I think you're golden there.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments on this before we move on to another issue?
Yeah, sure, Dan. Super fast. Selling stories with data is just regular course business. That it's table stakes now. Convincing somebody to write about you or your client or your organization with some, you know, broad stroke generic statements about how fantastic you are goes exceptionally nowhere. Even with data in your pitching and in hand, it's still, the bar is still higher. So the more you have, the better. And then in terms of conveying results on the back end, back to the client, I'd agree with what Sophie mentioned regarding kind of the veracity of some of the numbers that get shot around. In the absence of anything better, you're often kind of forced to rely on those things. But I'd say generally speaking, clients are getting a lot more demanding, and rightly so, of saying, show me the value chain from where you picked up the phone to where the story came out to where my business makes more money.
Right. Yeah, and really, I think so much of it is it's looking at the data in new ways that gain new insight, right? Like if all you're doing is saying, here's how many employers are planning on, hiring a more diverse workforce, big deal, right? But if you can develop an insight around that is not instantly obvious and that no one else has brought, it's hard getting that insight, but if you can mine the data for the insight, you might have something, right? And you got to do that. You got to have the skills on your team to do that.
You also have to be sorry to interrupt you, Dan, but you have to be 100% in the news cycle and be reading everything because,
Right.
They go so fast, like your data now could be old in 10 minutes. So it's very difficult. Yeah.
So there's some interesting question. There's an interesting question here about, when you're looking at key issues, and this is coming back to something, both Sean and Shabnam were talking about earlier, and that's kind of deciding where they want to lead, right? Shabnam mentioned safety, Sean mentioned mental health as examples of this. And so the question is, when you're monitoring these issues, how do you determine when it's the right time to step in and take a position? Like, what are some key indicators to indicate a white space? And and what indicators might say, no, just step back and keep watching? Who wants to jump in on this?
I'm happy to get it started. I think,
Yeah.
so one other, area we've really paid a lot of attention to is, becoming an employer of choice, and through a variety of different ways. And, it's really getting to those potential people who may want to join our company, as well as, to see what's possible at other employers. So I think we've done a lot of research on that, seeing what else is out there and finding ways that, contribute to the narrative of the pandemic and how companies are navigating, but also more importantly than that, no matter where you sit, how do you feel as an employee? What can your employer do to make that a better experience? So we put a lot of time into that. I think the results have been really solid there.
Yeah, so I'll just say from the TTC's perspective, issues where we wanted to lead on, or we felt that we had sort of a role to play, we wanted to come out early before a lot of things. And a big reason around that was we wanted to kind of drive the message and drive the story and kind of set up what that looks like. A big thing kind of for us this year, COVID aside, has been around diversity and inclusion, right? And obviously the TTC has a bit of a mixed past on that, not all good. But we decided those were also big focuses for us this year, given what was going on in the world. And we came out hard, we came out early, and we also used it as an opportunity to acknowledge our shortcomings, right? So I think for us, when you think about like what kind of drove us to do things, it was just really focusing on what was important to us. And if it was important to us, we would just move forward if it made sense, right? And, there was a lot this year around sort of like, George Floyd, and then, there was a lot of shootings and a lot of stuff. And we just felt we had something to say, and we didn't wait for the white face. We came out with what we wanted to say, and that was kind of it. And I think the thing about the TTC that's maybe different than a lot of other institutions is that, we're kind of big enough to do that, right? So we have the luxury of being able to sometimes drive the story and be the story in a way that others don't. And we certainly took advantage of it on issues where we felt were sort of mission critical to us as an organization.
Wojtek referred earlier to, a lot more interest in, crisis communications readiness, scenario planning. Is that factoring bigger into your plans for the year ahead, doing scenario planning or crisis prep work?
Yeah, absolutely. I would actually say that was sort of the big thing that came at the beginning of the pandemic, is like, I think notionally we were all kind of like, oh, we're ready for a crisis, we're ready for it. And then COVID hit in a way that I don't think any of us could have ever imagined, right? As a crisis, right? When you're at the TTC, you imagine a derailment, or, maybe somebody getting hit by a bus or something. Like you never imagined, I could have never imagined this, or all the sort of permutations and combinations it has taken. But I think what's been really good is that we've become very, very good at sort of looking at things that might be issues for us and preparing internally. So, now we do, I don't know if others do this, we do a lot more communications planning than we ever did before. Anything we think is an issue, we have a comms plan for, right? We think about internally, externally, we think about what the mayor's office is going to say, what our chair's office is going to say, what city council is going to say, and we plan for it now, right? Whereas before we flew by the seat of our pants a little bit, we do not do that anymore. And I think, to be honest, that's something that will stay forever. And we do it for issues big or small now too, right? And I think it's made us a lot more disciplined. I think that's really good. Not everybody on my team thinks that, because now we are writing comms plans like a lot more than we used to. So we're trying to find a balance, but I think that's it, right? Like, crisis is the new normal, change is the new normal, right? And those are really, I just use the new normal, so I'm sorry. But
that's okay.
Those are really the only, yeah.
You have to put $1 in the swear jar, so.
Yeah, I'm going to give you $2 now. But those are the only things that are constants, right? Change and crisis.
So.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a big thing for us.
Yeah, totally.
But can I add one
Jump in.
build there? So the level of care and detail that the TTC is putting into their crisis comms, which I think like they have to, given the size of their organization. I don't know how you guys do it. It's a lot to be in the news cycle so much like that every single day. But I think the challenge for most of the people on this call who probably don't live in a TTC world, right, where the news comes to find you and you're in it every day, is not just to do the crisis planning, but actually to do the proactive planning. Like decide what purpose-filled, values-based areas of conversation you think your company belongs in, and then work on it and take meaningful action before the conversation comes to find you. Like it breaks my heart, Dan, that like the Black North Initiative, like whatever, 400 companies signed that thing, and they signed it thinking that nobody was ever going to ask them later if they did anything, and then most of them didn't do anything. Right. So it's moments like that I think need to be very instructive for all of us, and media relations professionals can play a huge role in compelling leaders to think through, options and planning on the good news stories well before the conversation happens to you.
Yeah. No, that's such a good point, right? And sort of identify, what are the topics where we have expertise, where we have credibility, right? And I mean, you look at Nike, how controversial it was when they associated themselves with Colin Kaepernick, right? Boy, did they reap the advantages, in terms of being credible on that issue 2 years afterwards, right? Or 3 years, I think it was. Anyway, really interesting. Okay, so I wanted to ask about, there are two questions in the chat here, and happy to take anyone who wants to talk on either one. One is about bloggers, which is an interesting one because the definition of whom we are targeting as channels to our audiences, it's ever changing, right? There are also niche specialty publications that have cropped up, some of them with really outstanding writing, but there's also bloggers with a wide range of quality. What's your approach to bloggers? There's one question. The other one is around how you're defining your audience, the depth and the breadth of the audience, how you're kind of, thinking very deliberately about whom you're targeting. So
I have like one quick comment on the freelancers bloggers thing, and then I'll stop talking. But it's the Wild West out there, and many of the folks on my team are finding they're pitching these people, and then the people are like, "Oh, you should really pay us for this," or their journalistic ethics are kind of sketch. And in any ways, like they don't have much of an audience. And I feel the same way about podcasts, by the way, that there's no meaningful way to determine how big an audience is for a podcast. Like everybody's struggling with metrics around that. So again, like for me, it's just be careful. Be careful who you're targeting, and don't get overly excited about like, Substack writers who have like 10 followers.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Approaches to bloggers from others?
Yeah, just on the blogger point. I mean, I don't think you can say all bloggers are the same any more than you could say all journalists are the same. And so something we really put a premium on, is just getting to know the audiences that we're talking to through different forms of media, right? So that we know, how can we engage them properly when we have something we want to say. And to Sophie's point, yeah, some of them the message will be completely lost because they have a different mandate. Maybe it is paid content, but at least if you know that, and you know that well ahead of the time when you start pitching them, you're in a much, much better position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other approaches? Are bloggers in the TTC's landscape?
There are a lot of people who are interested in the TTC. For a variety of different reasons. So I think to sort of Sophie and Wojciech's points, there's a real variety in sort of what people write about and who follows them. We typically try to respond to every single request that comes in. The effort we put into the responses may vary, but we do respond to everybody. And that even goes for a lot of student newspapers. We always try to respond. We also respond to a lot of kids. We see the TTC as sort of an institution for everybody in Toronto and the GTA, and we try to give everybody sort of, a piece of it. So like last week, we did a podcast that a 10-year-old boy puts on with his mom. I'm not really sure who that following is, but you know what? He was really excited about it, and we thought, why not? So everybody who asks us a question at the TTC will get a response.
Yeah, that's a great principle. Okay, we're almost out of time, and it's such a shame because I kind of feel like this could go on. We could do this. We could take a little, bio break and come back and talk for another hour very easily with this incredible group. But I know that IABC likes to run on time. It's well organized. And so maybe I'll just put everyone on the spot real quick. A couple sentences from each of you. Last advice that you would give the business communicators watching today as they think about 2022. What have you learned this year that you think provides a really good lesson for them to keep top of mind for their planning for the year ahead? And I'll start with whoever wants to start. Otherwise, I'll pick someone.
It's Shabnam. I can go first.
Yeah.
I would just say be prepared. And if you think you're prepared, prepare some more. And that would be sort of what I would, my 2 cents.
All right. Preparation. There's no substitute. Who else?
I think Wojtek had mentioned it earlier, but really you cannot overemphasize how important it is to work on the relationships you've got with the press, because that is going to be your North Star for how you inform so many decisions and how you go back to leadership and say, this is what we're doing because we think it's going to resonate in a certain way. So spend lots of time on that. It will only well serve you.
Sophie, Wojtek?
I can go. I'll give Wojtek the last word if he wants it.
You may regret that.
Yeah. So what I've learned in the last year is that journalists, like PR people, like everybody's exhausted and tired and stressed. And and to your point, like record consumption, tons of noise. And in this environment where everybody's stressed, I think it's important that media relations professionals change their locus of control. What I mean by that is don't let the news happen to you. Figure out how you want to interact with the news. And in many cases, it may not be contacting a reporter. It may be something entirely different from an integrated perspective. Approach the work with objective curiosity and don't expect coverage, right? Like respect the fact that there's a lot going on in the world and maybe you're not the most interesting part of that story at the moment. But yeah, if you can keep that mindset, I think you'll be in a good posture to kind of move through the next year.
Love that sense of initiative. Don't let it happen to you, right? I've often said the 2 biggest predictors of success in the consulting part of our world of PR, it's initiative and perseverance. You got those 2 things, it makes up for a lot. Wojtek.
Look, I think if you're going to do 2 things differently, I'd say for your client or your organization, get your sophistication up. It's still shocking how often we meet communications people who, when asked something relatively simple, like how does your organization make money, struggle to explain that. And then think about how you can bridge the gap between you wanting that seat at the decision-making table and the degree of sophistication you need to have to be able to give decision-based advice and make advice-based decisions similarly for your clients. And then for your audiences, I would suggest to you that the single most important thing we could all focus on as a profession is simplicity. I think we do a tremendous disservice to everyone we serve, from our clients to our audiences to ourselves, frankly, by complicating and dressing things up in jargon and needless complexity. And the pandemic's taught us that when complexity and crisis meet, bad things happen. I would suggest to you, when complexity and the media meet, bad things happen also. To whatever extent you can, keep it simple and keep it understandable. The success rate of your efforts will go through the roof.
All right, great. Well said. Well said. Okay, so from the 5 of us, 8 words for you to remember for the year ahead: preparation, relationships, initiative, objectivity, curiosity, sophistication, simplicity, and perseverance. We wish you well. We thank you for the time that we've spent together today, and I'm going to pass it back to Mandy. And by the way, I want to thank Davida too for terrific organization of this event. It really has been very special to be part of it. Over to you, Mandy.
Thank you so much. And yes, I echo those sentiments to thank Jovita, as well as to thank all of you, Daniel, Sophie, Wojtek, Shabnam, and Sean. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today and for sharing your incredible wisdom and insights. I love how you wrapped everything up there, Dan, with those words of wisdom. And I wanted to thank all of our members for joining and non-members as well. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to attend this Toronto IBC event. And you will all receive a short survey. If you could take just a couple of minutes to complete it, just to let us know your thoughts and anything else you want to see on in the future and upcoming events, that would be great. So thank you all to our panelists again, and to Dan, and for everybody joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.